old man had his back to the road. He was standing at the fence line along the west pasture, both hands on the top rail, looking out across the field the way a man looks at something he is trying to memorize. The Angus cattle grazed maybe 40 yards out, unhurried, moving through the dry November grass with the absolute indifference of animals who do not understand what is about to change. Walter Gaines stood at the fence for a long time without moving. He was not crying, exactly. He was doing the thing men of a certain age and a certain temperament do when they will not allow themselves to cry in front of the open sky, pressing his mouth into a flat line and holding very still, breathing carefully, waiting for the moment to pass. It was not passing. His right hand moved along the fence rail in a small, slow motion, back and forth, and he did not seem to know he was doing it. 3 weeks from today, none of this would be his anymore. The documents were signed. The process was in motion. And standing at this fence on a Tuesday morning in Harlan, Idaho, Walter Gaines was doing the only thing left available to him, which was to look at what he was losing and refuse to look away from it. He had done this before. Burying a wife, burying a son. This was different. This was the land. Then a truck turned off the county road into the gravel drive, and a German shepherd put his paws on the passenger window and stared at the old man at the fence and the driver of the truck. A Marine gunnery sergeant named Jackson Reed felt something shift in the cab that he had learned, over 4 years and 2 continents, was never wrong. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from today. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay until the very end. What Jackson found at that fence, and what he and Sarge refused to leave until it was made right, is something no one in Harlan County expected to see. Jackson Reed was 42 years old, and looked, at first glance, like a man who had been built for outdoor work, which was accurate, in the sense that the work he had been built for had simply been conducted in places that made the outdoor work of most Americans look like an afternoon. He was 6 feet and 200 pounds, broad through the shoulders with large, weathered hands and a face that the Idaho sun and the years between had cut into a series of deliberate planes, a wide brow, a jaw that carried 3 days of dark stubble going gray, a nose with a subtle left lean from a break in Helmand Province in 2014 that had healed without formal attention, because the mission had not permitted a stop for formal attention. His eyes were a deep, still slate blue, the color of a mountain lake in late autumn, and they were the kind of eyes that registered everything and returned nothing, not coldly, but with the complete economy of a man who had learned to receive information without telegraphing what he intended to do with it. He was not, by his own reckoning, a complicated person. He had a clear sense of what was right, a deep reluctance to say so out loud, and a consistent tendency to do it anyway, without announcement. He had served 13 years in the United States Marine Corps as a gunnery sergeant with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. 3 deployments: Ramadi in 2009, Helmand Province in 2012 and 2014. He had come home from his final deployment with a Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal with a Combat V device, a left knee that had been surgically reconstructed at Bethesda Naval and that tracked correctly on flat ground and incorrectly on everything else, and a particular relationship with silence that people who hadn't served sometimes mistook for aloofness, and that people who had served recognized immediately as the specific, calibrated quiet of a man who has learned that most things don't require commentary to be understood. He had retired from service in 2018 and returned to Harlan, Idaho, where he had grown up and where he had been doing land and property work for the county assessor's office for the past 3 years. A job he had taken because it got him outside and because it required precision, and because it occasionally, in the way of small counties, put him in proximity to situations that needed someone to pay attention to them. He was driving back from a site assessment on the north end of Harlan County when he turned onto the county road running past the Gaines property. He had driven past this land his entire life. He had not known, until that Tuesday, that it was in trouble. Sarge was 8 years old and wore his age the way working dogs wear age, not as decline, but as refinement. Every unnecessary thing long since stripped away, and only the essential remaining. His coat was a deep, dense black and tan, the black running in a solid saddle from the base of his skull to the root of his tail and down his legs to the pastern. The tan warm and clear along his chest and face, and the undersides of his legs faded slightly at the muzzle from the years. He weighed 89 pounds. His left rear leg had a mild but permanent outward set to it from the penetrating wound he had taken during a building clearance in Ramadi in 2009. A fragment that had passed through the muscle above the stifle joint and had been field treated and had healed clean, but had left the leg with its own opinion about how it wanted to track, which the leg had maintained without apology for 14 years. His left ear had a smooth, half-moon notch along the forward edge, healed silver, from the same incident. He moved with the deep, unhurried deliberateness of an animal who has concluded that speed is for situations that have not yet been understood, and that most situations, attended to properly, resolve more cleanly than speed allows. Jackson had finalized his adoption from the military working dog program after 7 months of paperwork and 2 congressional contacts and 1 phone call with a very patient colonel at Pendleton who had ultimately agreed that yes, some situations fell outside standard procedure, and this appeared to be one of them. Sarge had been in Jackson's truck, his house, and his life every day since. He was not a pet. He was, in Jackson's considered assessment, the most reliable judge of character he had ever encountered in any species. The Gaines property was 340 acres of mixed pasture and timber in the foothills east of Harlan, Idaho, at an elevation where the November air carried the first serious cold of the season, and the light came in long and low and turned the dry grass the color of old copper. The fence line along the west pasture ran parallel to the county road behind a single row of lodgepole pines that had been planted, by the look of them, before Jackson Reed had been born. The cattle in the pasture were the last of a herd that had grazed this land for 43 years. The farmhouse at the end of the gravel drive was white with green trim. 2 stories, with a covered porch running the full front length and a barn behind it that had been painted the same green as the trim and that showed, in the deliberate maintenance of its boards and the precise alignment of its doors, the long history of a man who kept things because things were worth keeping. The whole property smelled of cold air and pine and dry earth, and something older and harder to name. The smell of a place that has been worked by the same hands for so long that the hands and the land have become indistinguishable from each other. Walter Gaines was 73 years old and had the particular physical quality of a man who has spent his life in outdoor labor, not large, not imposing, but dense, as if gravity had a slightly stronger claim on him than on ordinary men, as if decades of working ground had pressed something permanent into the way he stood and moved. He was 5'10" and lean, with white hair and a face mapped by weather and sun and the specific expressiveness of a man who does not speak often, and therefore, when his face moves, it moves with weight behind it. He had homesteaded this land with his wife Ruth in 1981. Ruth had died of cancer in 2017. Their son Michael had died of a heart attack at 44 in 2019, leaving behind a daughter in Boise who called on holidays and a gap in the operation of the farm that Walter had filled for the past 4 years by simply working harder than a man of 73 should have to work. He had not complained about this. It was his land. Working it was not a burden. It was the definition of a day. The trouble had begun 2 years ago, when Walter had taken a short-term operating loan from an agricultural financing company called Horizon Land Capital to cover the cost of replacing a failing well system and repairing the barn roof after a winter storm. The loan terms had seemed straightforward. The representative who had come to the farm, a courteous man named Derek Vance from Horizon's Boise regional office, had walked the property with Walter and had expressed what appeared to be genuine respect for what Walter had built, and had drawn up a loan document that was 31 pages long and contained, on page 19, a provision that Walter had read and had not fully understood, and had signed because the man had been courteous and because the rate was reasonable, and because Walter had been 71 years old and tired and had not had a lawyer look at it, which was the only thing Walter Gaines had done in 43 years of farming this land that he would come to regret. Horizon Land Capital was not a traditional agricultural lender. It was a subsidiary of a Phoenix-based real estate acquisition firm called Western Consolidated Holdings, which had been identified in a 2022 investigative report by the Idaho Statesman as one of several firms using farm distress loans as a mechanism to acquire rural properties at below-market prices. The provision on page 19 allowed Horizon to accelerate the full loan balance upon any default, including a missed payment of less than 30 days. 14 months into the 2-year loan, Walter had missed a payment by 19 days because a check from his cattle broker had cleared 8 days later than expected. Horizon had sent the acceleration notice the following Monday. The balance due was $87,400. Walter did not have $87,400 liquid. The foreclosure process had begun in the spring. The sale date had been set for the first week of December. Walter had spoken with 2 attorneys. One had told him the provision was legally enforceable, and the other had not returned his calls. He had not told his granddaughter. He had not told anyone. He had been standing at the fence line trying to memorize the pasture for 3 weeks. Jackson had not known any of this when he pulled into the gravel drive that Tuesday morning. He had pulled in because Sarge had put his paws on the passenger window and held them there, not the restless movement of a dog who wants out of the truck, but the locked, deliberate posture of a dog who has identified something that requires attention. And because Jackson had learned, over 14 years, that the correct response to that posture was to stop the truck. He got out. Sarge got out beside him and walked directly toward the fence line and sat down 10 feet from Walter Gaines and looked at the old man with the amber gold focus he brought to things he had decided needed to be stayed with. Walter turned at the sound of boots on frozen gravel. He looked at the dog first, then at Jackson, and in the moment before his face returned to its careful neutral, Jackson saw what was there. "Morning," Jackson said. "Morning," Walter said. Jackson walked to the fence and stood beside the old man and looked out at the pasture because that seemed like the right thing to do before asking anything, and after a moment he said, quietly, "How long have you had this place?" Walter told him 43 years. He said it the way people say things that are both facts and griefs at the same time, with the flat economy of someone who has already done the math and knows there is nothing left to carry past the number. Jackson nodded slowly. He said, "Something going on with it?" A long pause. The cattle moved through the copper grass. The wind came through the lodgepole pines with a low, steady sound. Sarge had not moved from where he sat, 10 feet from Walter, facing him, unhurried, completely present. "Nothing I can fix," Walter said. Jackson Reed had spent 13 years in environments where the most critical information was the information no one was volunteering, and he had spent 3 more years in a county assessor's office reading property documents, and he had grown up in Harlan and knew the name of every family that had farmed this county for the past half-century. He said, Would you let me look at the paperwork? Walter looked at him for a long moment. He looked at the dog. Sarge's tail moved twice, slowly, against the cold ground. Walter said, "Come inside." Then, the loan document was in a manila folder in the kitchen drawer, organized with the careful precision of a man who keeps records because he takes his life seriously, even the parts of it that are going wrong. Jackson sat at the kitchen table and read all 31 pages in 40 minutes while Walter made coffee without asking if he wanted any and set a cup at his elbow without comment. Sarge lay on the kitchen floor at Walter's feet, chin on paws, eyes at half-mast, breathing at the long, easy rate he used when a situation had been assessed and found to require patience rather than action. Jackson read page 19 twice. He read it a third time. Then he called his contact at the Idaho Department of Finance, a senior examiner named Carol Bates, who had been in agricultural lending regulation for 16 years and who had, on 2 prior occasions, helped Jackson identify predatory provisions in rural loan documents he had come across through the county assessor's work. Horizon Land Capital, Carol said when he gave her the name. "You know them. We opened a review file on them in March," she said. "I have 4 other farmers in the state with nearly identical acceleration clauses. 2 of them already lost their property." She paused. "What's the sale date?" "December 4th. "That's 3 weeks," she said. "I know," Jackson said. "What do I need?" Carol told him. She needed the full document, the acceleration notice, the original payment history, and any correspondence between Walter and Horizon after the acceleration. She told him the acceleration clause might have a deficiency under the Idaho Consumer Protection Act if the loan had been marketed as an agricultural operating loan, because that classification triggered disclosure requirements that the clause on page 19 may not have satisfied. It was not certain. It was enough to file for an emergency injunction with the Idaho 3rd Judicial District, and if the injunction was granted, it would halt the sale pending a full review of the loan's compliance with Idaho lending statutes. She was not making a promise. She was giving him a path. Jackson said he understood. He thanked her and hung up and looked across the kitchen table at Walter Gaines, who had been sitting with both hands wrapped around his coffee cup, listening to a conversation he had not expected to have this morning, when he woke up alone in a house that was 3 weeks from not being his. "Is there something there?" Walter said. "There might be," Jackson said. "I need everything you have, every piece of paper, every voicemail, every email. And I need you to talk to a lawyer today, a specific one." He put a name and a number on the table. A Boise attorney named Lena Park, who handled agricultural lending cases and who had, in 2 prior situations Jackson knew of, successfully challenged acceleration provisions in distress loan documents. Her office doesn't charge for an initial consultation. Call her this afternoon. Walter looked at the paper. He looked at Jackson for a moment with the expression of a man who is not accustomed to being helped and who is not sure what the correct response is. Then he looked at Sarge, who had raised his head from the kitchen floor and was watching Walter with the calm, specific attention he brought to moments when he wanted a person to understand something was real. Walter picked up the paper. He called Lena Park at 2 that afternoon. She called Jackson at 4:30. "The disclosure on the acceleration clause is deficient," she said, without preamble. The loan was classified as an agricultural operating loan in the marketing materials, which triggers a specific disclosure requirement under Idaho Code Section 2841-103. The provision on page 19 does not include the required language. "I can file for emergency injunction by Friday." She filed it Thursday evening. The Idaho 3rd Judicial District granted the emergency injunction at 8:52 on Friday morning, halting the December 4th sale pending a compliance review of the loan documents. Derek Vance of Horizon Land Capital called Walter's cell phone at 9:17 Friday morning. "Mr. Gaines," he said, "I think there may have been a miscommunication about. You'll want to talk to my attorney," Walter said. He gave Derek Vance the number and hung up. And he stood in his kitchen for a moment with the phone in his hand and looked out the window at the barn his father had helped him paint green and said nothing out loud. Because some things don't require saying out loud. Jackson and Sarge were sitting on the porch when Walter came outside. Sarge stood when he heard the screen door. He walked to where Walter stood at the top of the porch steps and pressed the full length of his right side against the old man's leg and stayed there. Walter put his hand on the dog's back, low in the place between the shoulder blades, and held it there with his eyes on the pasture and the lodgepole pines and the long, flat November light that was making everything the color of something you want to keep. The Idaho Department of Finance completed its compliance review of Horizon Land Capital's agricultural loan portfolio in February of the following year. The review found deficient disclosure provisions in 11 of 17 distress loans issued in Idaho over a 22-month period. The Idaho Attorney General's office opened a consumer protection investigation in March. Lena Park filed civil suits on behalf of 4 affected farmers, including Walter Gaines, seeking rescission of the acceleration provisions and damages. Western Consolidated Holdings, Horizon's parent company, settled the Idaho suits in July for a total of $1.2 million and agreed to a consent order requiring the reformation of all outstanding loan documents in the state. Derek Vance resigned from Horizon's Boise office in April. The company's Idaho operating license was placed under a 2-year probationary compliance review. 2 of the farmers who had already lost their properties received settlement funds sufficient to purchase replacement land. Walter Gaines did not lose the farm on Alcott Road. Not 1 acre of it. 5 months after the Tuesday morning Jackson Reed pulled into the gravel drive, he drove back out to the Gaines property on a Saturday in early April, when the pasture had gone green again and the Angus cattle were moving through it, with the same unhurried indifference they had always moved through it, as if the winter's events had been nothing more than weather, which in a certain sense they had. Walter had a second cup of coffee waiting at the kitchen table, and a piece of pie from the church potluck the night before that he put down without asking whether Jackson wanted it. Sarge went directly to his spot on the kitchen floor and lay down with his chin on his paws. He knew this kitchen. He had been coming back to it since November, because some places, once a dog has decided they are worth staying in, do not easily release their claim on him. Walter was different in the April light. Not transformed, he was still a man of few words and careful expression, and the particular density of someone shaped by decades of hard use, but the flat, held-in quality was gone from his face, the careful suppression of a man trying not to let the open sky see what it was costing him to stand in it. He talked about the spring work. He talked about a new calf born the week before, a heifer he had named Ruth, which was not something he explained, and which Jackson did not ask about. He talked about his granddaughter coming out from Boise in June, the first time she'd been to the farm since Michael died, and about how the east bedroom needed painting before then, and how he reckoned he'd get to it on the next dry weekend. There was nothing performed in any of it. He was simply a man talking about his work and his plans, and his land, which was the only version of Walter Gaines that this farm had ever been designed to contain. At some point, Jackson looked over, and Walter was looking out the kitchen window at the pasture with the April sun on his face. And there was something there, not a full smile, exactly in the way that word is usually used, but the particular ease of a man who has stopped holding something, and who has, in the absence of the weight, rediscovered the original shape of his face. It was enough. It was more than enough. Sarge's tail moved against the kitchen floor. Slow, full, back and forth. Back and forth. The story was over, and the dog knew it. Sometimes miracles don't announce themselves at the gate. Sometimes they turn off a county road because a dog puts his paws on the window, and they sit at a kitchen table and read 31 pages of fine print, and they make 2 phone calls and show up again the next week and the week after that, until the thing that was being taken is no longer being taken, and the man who is losing it can look at his own pasture without holding his face together with both hands. God does not always send rescue wearing armor. Sometimes he sends it in a county truck with a dog riding shotgun on a Tuesday morning in November when a man is standing at a fence line trying to memorize what he is about to lose. The land we build with our hands is not just property. It is the accumulated weight of every morning we chose to stay, every season we worked through, every loss we absorbed and kept going past. When someone tries to take that from a man who earned it acre by acre across 43 years, something is being taken from all of us. And sometimes God places someone at the right fence line at the right moment to make sure it isn't taken without a fight. If Walter's story touched your heart, share it today with someone who needs to be reminded that the land and the people who love it still have defenders. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever known a farmer, a rancher, or anyone who built something by hand over a lifetime, we'd love to hear their name today. Their story is worth remembering. If you believe in courage, in loyalty, and in the kind of justice that keeps its voice down and gets the work done anyway, please subscribe so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and give you the grace tonight to stay at the fence for someone who is trying not to let the skies see him cry.